new tool from the Commerce Department for diagnosing and assessing supply chain and enterprise risk. John Rogula is managing director and leader of the enterprise risk management offering of Baker Tilly. Hello, John.
Good morning, Robert. How are you?
Good. Thanks for being with me today. Tell me about this new tool from the Department of Commerce. What's it all about?
Yeah, so what the Department of Commerce is providing to us is a tool that they've categorized or called Scale. And it's to provide organizations additional insights from an external perspective of what are the significant supply chain risks that organizations should consider as they're reviewing their enterprise risk profile and developing mitigation strategies of where they should be focusing efforts and their capital to ensure a resilient organization.
Well, it sounds like a tool of great value to companies that are placing more emphasis on risk management than ever before. But how do you think, based on what you know about it, I mean, this is sort of a sneak preview of its release, but based on what we know about it to date, how does it work?
Yeah, so from what we know about it to date, right, and we've seen the term heat map,
Mhm.
it's our assumption that they're going to be looking at different perceived risk, right? And we define risk as a future uncertainty that can create variance against stated objectives.
Mhm.
And so looking for those uncertainties that would be out on the horizon and then providing an assessment of those risks using scales. And typically we see the scale of impact as well as probability or the likelihood of that risk occurring, and then plotting it against those two scales in order to create a prioritization of risk for the different industries to consider with regards to supply chain specifically.
Mhm. Well, it sounds interesting, but industries vary in their degree of risk, and indeed, companies within industries vary with their degree of risk. So, a general assessment might not seem that valuable. So, how can the tool be tweaked, or how can it be made to allow for these individual industries to set their own tolerances on the heat map that are unique to their particular needs?
Right. And I think the Department of Commerce isn't suggesting that it's a one size fits all,
Mhm.
right? And I think they're providing it as an additional insight to supplement an enterprise risk management process that an organization might already have or looking to implement, where they're considering the risk in the context, as you said, of their own tolerance, but in addition, their own ability to manage risk, right? There
Mhm.
might be risks on this heat map that an organization A might be very good at managing the root causes of those risks, so it might not elevate to the level of severity as it would for an organization B that doesn't have the same level of management and risk management capabilities, where it might be, necessitate that it remains at an elevated concern with
Mhm.
regards to their own resilience.
What's your sense of what might also be out there in the private sector, or what organizations might be already employing their own tools that are similar to this, or is this a completely unique offering that just hasn't been seen before?
So, with regards to the Department of Commerce or any of the departments, it's really one of the first tools that I've seen where they're really trying to provide an additional lens for leadership teams within the organization to consider risk, and in this case, specific to supply chain. But I do know that with the advancement of AI at Baker Tilly, we're leveraging AI in order to do something very similar, but not on specific supply chain risk, but on a more broad perspective with regards to enterprise risk, right? So providing our clients with a lens of what are those emerging risks if we look across competitors, if we look at industry documentation and insights, what are those risks that the experts are forecasting are emerging on the horizon that should also be incorporated into the evaluation of enterprise risks and how we're prioritizing those risks.
When you say enterprise risk as opposed to supply chain risk, and I guess you mean it's much more comprehensive than what people would consider to be just a supply chain, what types of risks are we talking about? I mean, they seem, I'm sure there's some obvious ones, but what in your estimation are the big risks that a tool like this should be taking into account?
Yeah, so there's guidance around that, Robert. And traditionally, we focused on strategic risk, operational risk, which certainly supply chain could fit within, financial risk, technical risk, legal and regulatory risk. But we've also started to see in companies incorporate additional categories around specifically ESG
Hmm.
and the diversity elements of ESG, because those really don't fall into one of those prior categories. For example, ESG, it really covers aspects of all five of those categories,
Hmm.
right? So it needs to be incorporated into that consideration, as well as we see clients putting a real lens towards external risk, right? You can only get so far by asking, your internal to the company, what are their perspectives of the most significant risk? Because they're in the day-to-day activity, right? And so they're going to be
Right.
focused on what they know. But having that external view and insight, very similar to the scale tool, it just gives you a level of validation and confidence that you've considered the full scope of the possible risk.
Certainly in 2019 or 2020, what they know, quote unquote, would not have helped them very much to anticipate COVID-19. Uh,
I think that's a really an interesting point, Robert, and it brings up the conversation around black swans, right? Very high impact risk, but
mhm,
very low probability. I can say back in 2019, about 80% of my clients had a COVID type event within their risk register. The issue is that they assigned such a low probability to it, and the equations that they were using to evaluate risk, they were giving equal weight to impact and likelihood.
mm.
And so it diminished the positioning of the risk within the heat map. I think the lesson learned for a lot of our clients is perhaps an equal weighting shouldn't be distributed across impact and likelihood, but perhaps we should give a special lens to those risks that are highly impactful but very unlikely,
Mhm.
because those are going to be the most damaging to our resilience, right? And again, I think it's to be seen, but I would imagine that the scale tool will incorporate that into their heat map as well.
Well, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the coiner of the phrase black swan, pointed out in his original book, these so-called highly unlikely events have a nasty habit of actually happening. So, a,
That's absolutely true.
a tool like this is of great value, but it can't be a static model, can it, John? I mean, it has to be dynamic in the sense that it has to have input that is constantly updating the current situation and what are the risks of the moment. So I take it, I'm sure the DOC tool would do that, and I'm sure that tools that you have seen otherwise also have that capability, right?
They absolutely do. And it's really around, as you mentioned earlier, around tolerance for an organization. There's also tolerance or triggers or measures that we can apply, for an example, against geopolitical risks that might impact the supply chain, right? We can have the right sensors and dynamic sensors to indicate against separate parameters where perhaps a supply chain disruption event is increasing in probability,
Mhm.
and incorporate that directly into the model to keep it dynamic.
You cited artificial intelligence, which essentially has turbocharged the ability of companies to get a grip on what's going on out there and then analyze and do stuff enough with with those statistics that they can be of actual use to the organization. What more work is to be done in this area, though? I'm sure we are never going to say that a model like this is perfect. What more has to happen? I don't know if the DOC model tool will have that, but what do you see as being the need for further work in this whole area of enterprise risk management?
Yeah, so I think one is around the adjustment of the impact and the likelihood probabilities to adjust for overall those black swan events, right? Incorporating those.
Mhm.
Another advancement that we've seen in the last 2 or so years is around inclusion of velocity, right? So not just assessing the impact and the likelihood of the risk, but when it does occur, how quickly are we going to feel that impact?
Right.
Right? And I think that's critically important when you think about the supply chain, because it could directly impact different strategies that an organization might instill in order to offset the impact that a supply chain risk might have. An example would be an inventory management strategy. Now, I had a client several years ago where they were doing a supply chain assessment. It was with regards to ingredients in order to raw material ingredients in order to make their product,
Yeah.
and it drastically changed many different facets with regards to their strategy, including the inventory strategy, prioritizing customers, prioritizing what products are in demand and what we will make if we have limited inventory of raw materials, right? So planning ahead in determining what are those potential impacts to the supply chain, and then getting the whole organization assembled in order to develop and understand first what's going to be impacted, and then developing a resilience strategy around that's critically important. And I don't think many organizations, we gave the definition of risk. Often I see organizations focused more on issues, which would be no longer a risk. They're there.
Yeah.
And that's part of their enterprise risk management program, as opposed to truly focusing on those future uncertainties, the things we don't yet are not yet managing because they have not yet occurred,
Mhm.
or we're proactively managing so they don't occur.
What we know, what we see is simply not enough in this. So, John Rogula of Baker Tilly, thank you so much for helping to give us a sneak peek of this new enterprise risk management tool from the Department of Commerce, as well as talking about the larger issue of enterprise risk management and where it needs to go to further help companies deal with future risk. Thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate the time.